So, we watch Raw every single week, not just for the podcast. I mean, we're wrestling fans, breaking news.
Yeah,
But
it's somewhat that which we love, or whatever we say at the beginning of the show.
exactly that thing at the beginning. You should know by it. You should know it by now. That's beside the point. But I felt something was missing. Like when there's a really good wrestling show, even before it, you feel pumped up. And like over the course of around the past 2 months, I would say that we haven't felt, generally speaking, as excited before, during, and after Raw. It's sort of like, these things happen, this other one, but there's not that hunger. Maybe something shocking happens, like Brock Lesnar winning the championship, but the product as a whole feels like it's in this transition period. I mean, this always happens. This is nothing new. But then it sort of spawned a conversation that I actually want to bring up, which is, you know, is there such a thing as paying too much attention to wrestling? And I'm not saying watching too much wrestling. There's a difference. Paying too much attention involves, like, when you watch wrestling, do you just sit down and look at it? Do you sit down and check out social media? Do you sit down and make lunch? Obviously, this depends on the scenario. We have three.
It's a very late lunch.
Yeah. I mean, dinner. Well, you can make. I actually make lunch during Raw for the next day. So.
Oh well, there you go.
Yeah.
There you
So
go.
considering the fact that we have three completely different lifestyles and we're somewhat maybe international, I want to ask you guys. So, number one, how is it that you watch wrestling? I mean, aside from like us talking to each other, like what's your general experience? And then sort of part two, do you feel like a slight burnout or just maybe like, this fire doesn't burn always?
So I guess I'll pick it up from there, Juan. So thanks for that. But the way I watch Raw is very casual. I mean, I think the main reason why it's hard for me to just literally sit there and just watch that and give attention to nothing else is that it's 3 hours, and that's a large part of a Monday. So I like to sort of also be in front of my computer, browse websites. I'm talking to these guys on Skype. So, it's a fun way to watch the show. I definitely enjoy talking about Raw as I'm watching it with people that also enjoy the show. So that definitely helps keep me interested because there's, for 3 hours, sometimes maybe only a third of the show is actually really good. And, obviously that changes Raw to Raw, but the average Raw can sometimes be hard to get through. So other things kind of help me and keep me from just basically wanting to shut it off and go to bed or something like that.
Yeah, I basically watch it the exact same way Ryan does. I have multiple monitors, so Raw will always be on the side monitor while I'm browsing or the internet, looking at something, talking with you jabronis. Because exactly like you said, Ryan, sometimes 3 hours just feels a little bit too long. Like, take the average Raw that we talk about. Maybe we talk about 3-4 segments. Clock it in at about 15-20 minutes a segment. We're barely hitting an hour at that point. And there's still 2 more hours of every episode of Monday Night Raw that basically feel like filler. And that can just be a little too much sometimes.
Yeah, I agree completely because when a Raw is good, the 3 hours feel like an hour. But when a Raw is bad, the 3 hours feel like 5. And generally speaking, I watch it more or less the same way that you guys do. I do pay a little bit more. I'm more obsessed about wrestling. Breaking news. You guys have always sort of know that. So like I'll consume all kinds of wrestling. But even sometimes that I'll have like my full attention. I'm like, I'd almost rather go back and watch an old pay-per-view, or like an old Raw, because it doesn't feel like this is. I can get a 10-second recap next week of what is happening right now. Or like how many times can we watch Cesaro RVD? I get it. Not all fans are like we that watch on a weekly basis. I was watching SummerSlam, and some of the guys that I was watching with, they were asking me, who's this guy called Cesaro? Who's, RVD's back. So it's for those fans. But once again, with us, the ones that devote a weekly thing, a lot of times I'll say we sort of get punished for that. Understandably so, we're probably the minority. But sort of going back to that, yeah, I'll just sit down, I'll talk to you guys, I'll check the Twitter and Facebook every once in a while just to sort of see, if there's anything funny. But I'll try to analyze sort of like what's going on, how are they going next week. But it's it's hard to get through sometimes, especially when it's stuff like Bella's. I'm like, I'll wake up at 5 a.m. sometimes for work. I'll get home like an hour before Raw, and it's like I'm watching this. It's hard. It's hard. So,
So thanks, Bellas.
yeah, look at what you've done. So sort of as a point five version of this question, if Raw was 2 hours, I mean, which we've had Raw for 2 hours for a couple of years. Was it the same experience, or did you find yourself watching it more? Keeping in mind also, we had less chores and responsibilities, but moving that aside, was the attention span the same?
I honestly don't think there's a good answer to that question because you're really just trading one evil for another. Because if Raw went back to 2 hours, the conversation would shift to, well, these guys don't get screen time. We're seeing the same thing every week over and over and over again, and it might just get boring in that respect.
That's a good point, but I felt the 2 hour Raw, whether, sometimes it was bad or good, was at least only 2 hours and sort of helped not burn you out of it.
I mean, it's much more consumable at 2 hours. Like, that 60 minutes makes a world of difference.
I mean, and we think about wrestling where it's like, it's insane that a TV show, weekly TV show is 2 hours long. What, besides maybe the news or some other thing like that, what other TV show on the planet is 2 hours long? Never mind 3 hours long. It's crazy. Besides maybe a football game or something like that. But I mean, it's more produced like a television show than a sporting event. I mean, it is a hybrid, but you get what I'm saying.
And sort of bring up the second question I had first. Does this burn you out? Let's be honest. Being completely sincere about our situations. Does the whole fact that Raw is 3 hours long on a weekly basis, no matter how much you love wrestling, does it get a little bit tiring?
I think the way I watch Raw really helps me avoid burnout, because I personally don't feel burnt out at all, but it's because Raw, when it's on, doesn't have my undivided attention. I'm just watching it, and then when something awesome happens, I'll give it my full undivided attention, but once it's over, I move back to the next thing. So it really helps avoid burnout. And no, I really don't feel burnt out.
I do. I absolutely do. I mean, I feel like there's very little that has my interest right now, especially since Dean Ambrose was like the one thing that I was really excited about. His singles run, and I'm really liking where they're what he's doing with his character and his feud with Seth Rollins, and that was sort of like the last thing that was really holding my interest. I did enjoy Daniel Bryan's sort of rise and all of that. So a lot of the things that kept me interested aren't on the show right now. I feel like the show is very weak right now. So it's making it a lot harder to stay interested. So I do feel burnt out. I mean, I still plan to watch. I'm still dedicated to this podcast, and I do still love wrestling. So I won't give up on that. And it doesn't always get my undivided attention, especially lately, because of that interest. But one thing that will always get my full attention, if I can help it, are the pay-per-views, and I still enjoy watching those.
Exactly. I think that, there's always the monthly payoff, or, sometimes we get even two on the odd month. With the pay-per-views, great matches. I'm sort of in the middle ground. Like, I'm not burnt out, but I'll admit there are points in Raw where I'm like, seriously, I do have things I need to do in my personal life. And, like, I'm trying to watch this, but it doesn't feel like I should be. So that's where, I start checking the email and all that stuff. So, final question about this then, because we were sort of discussing this last night, and I thought it was really interesting. Is there such a thing as one particular way to enjoy wrestling?
I don't think there's one way to anything, you could probably argue. So, if whatever way you enjoy something is the way you should do it, as long as it's not negatively affecting others. I mean, if you like watching wrestling with the volume at max while stomping around and beating people up, well, that's not very practical for everybody else.
Exactly. I think it's a matter of, as long as you enjoy it, specifically with wrestling, because as you mentioned, Ryan, it's a hybrid. It's not a movie. It's not sports. It's in between. So even though you do need to sit down and watch something, it's prone to errors. It's prone to extending things for the sake of time, for the sake of pay-per-views. So I think that creating that balance, especially nowadays, gives you sort of a nice option to keep yourself tuning in.
Yeah, and another thing about wrestling though is I don't think there's any other I don't think there's any other show or sport or anything that sort of demands as much time as wrestling does to keep up with it, or WWE as as an organization. Because I mean, you're thinking 3 hour, even just Raw, 3 hours a week, every single week. There's no off season like football or baseball or anything like that. There's SmackDown too, if you want to count 5 hours of television on its own, not even counting main event on the network.
NXT.
And then you get the monthly pay-per-view. I mean, if you actually want to consume even just Raw, that's, you're demanding, what is it, like 900 hours? Would that be, no, not, wait, no.
What math are you trying to do?
How many weeks are there in a year?
No, how many, 52 weeks times 3. I'm
352 hours.
352 hours. I was thinking over a few years, but I don't know where I got those numbers.
Yeah. It's a wrestling podcast, not a math one.
That's why I talk about wrestling. So that's a lot of time, and that's just Raw. And if you watch SmackDown on the pay-per-views, clock some more hours on there. So, I mean, I think it's just easier to get burnt out on wrestling because there's no break if you want to keep up with it.
Exactly. So to conclude, wrestling is an investment. There is burnout, but there's also ways you can really find, like Heath, he will browse social media and all that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think as long as you enjoy wrestling and also you know what's going on, you don't just go like, oh, I think something happened to each and every segment. Guess what? To each his own.
Let me run something by you, guys. Is the Hulu version of Raw potentially the best version of Raw to watch?
I would argue that. I've only watched a couple of them on Hulu, but I know like my friend, he'll always watch the beginning of Raw or something, and then the next day he'll just watch the Hulu version. And they cut out a lot of the fillers. Sometimes every once in a while they do cut out a segment that's worth watching. You can always look it up on YouTube. WWE even uploads a lot of their stuff on there too, so you can watch it legally. Even if, so there's the one-off segment you miss, but you get sort of the moments that you're looking for when they kind of cut it down to 2 hours. So potentially. But you miss, one just quick thing is you miss the live experience if you're into the social media and discussion. That's about the only part you miss, but if you don't care about that, then maybe the Hulu version is better.
So there's probably 1,001 ways to watch wrestling. Let us know what your way is. Send us a tweet at ByteThatCast. You can be on your couch, on the toilet. It can happen. I mean, technology is crazy nowadays. It can be while playing Hearthstone. It can be by playing whatever it is you're playing. I just made these guys very happy. So thank you for tuning in.
I'm thinking about a world where you spend 3 hours on the toilet on Mondays. That sounds like heaven.
# heavenly hemorrhoids. So with that being said, Ryan, take us home, buddy.